the HorsePlayerNow.com team of Joe Christopher and Brian Nadeau for another edition of Horse Racing Video Night School. And Brian, on this episode, we're going to talk all about trip handicapping. And I think whether it's thoroughbreds, standardbreds, or quarter horses, the best horse doesn't always win.
Yeah, absolutely, and you don't always see that on paper when you look at the past performances. A lot of time trip notes get lost in the shuffle. Maybe the chart caller missed something, didn't pick up a certain horse, and you need to know that when you're handicapping a race, because oftentimes those are the horses you should be looking for at overlaid odds, at better prices, because they ran winning races that just didn't get picked up in the chart.
While the common perception might be that trip handicapping is all about trouble and trouble notes, but that isn't necessarily the case. Pace comes into play, positioning comes into play. You want to look at every horse at every race that you're watching the replay for and find out how they got from the gate to the wire and if they were compromised or aided in any way.
Yeah, absolutely. One of my favorite kind of trip notes might be a horse that vied in between two other dueling leaders, and he finished second while those other two horses finished 5th and 7th and were beaten about 15 lengths. That kind of gets lost in the shuffle. People don't really necessarily pick up on that, especially maybe the race was won by a deep closer. That effort's going to look a lot better on paper than it really was, and those are the kind of horses you want to play against next time out, and conversely, the second place finisher is a horse you want to back, especially if they meet a field with a lot less pace next time around.
For Brian Nadeau, I'm Joe Christopher. This video episode of Horse Racing Night School is sure to be a trip.
I think the first thing is that there's only so much handicapping you can do on paper. You can do a great deal of good handicapping on paper, but those running lines and those short trip notes that you're going to get in your past performances are never going to tell a true story. There's obvious trip notes to take, you know, a horse getting stuck in the stretch in traffic with nowhere to go. But there's also a lot of different, sort of more hidden ways that you can find trouble. I think that the first turn of a route race is very frequently overlooked. You know, people will say, oh, the horse was 4 wide on the second turn, but if the horse was 5 wide going into the first turn and the entire way around too, don't forget that, because that's ground loss too. A lot of trouble happens in the first turn that doesn't seem as big because it's sort of the beginning of the race. I mean, that's one of the first things I would say. And then horses getting taken out of their styles is another one. Speed horse with a slow break, that's the end of the day for that horse 9 times out of 10. Even a tactical pace horse who gets stuck at the back, always look for that.
I think the moral of the story is positioning is huge in horse racing, based on your style, but a lot of times when horses are learning to do something or horses are inexperienced, positioning is so key, especially in those 2-turn turf races like you're talking about. Squeeze at the start, lost ground, had to steady. Not putting yourself into the race can really be a huge disadvantage, but you may be able to take advantage of that the next time the horse runs.
Absolutely. You get the ground lost in a turn, in the first turn, I think is huge, especially I'm a big turf handicapper. Looking for a horse that, like Brian said, I'm talking trip handicapping, first thing I think of is ground lost. How inefficient was the trip? Were they strung out wide? Would they have to do a lot more work than any other horses in the race? That to me is a bad trip. So I'm looking for that kind of thing in a race. The next thing I think of when a trip handicap is inefficient trip from perspective of I can't move where I want to go. Am I stuck at the rail? Am I stuck between? Absolutely. So it's not just about the ground covered, but it's about the efficiency and the momentum of the trip. So I think if you look at those two things, you really find a quote-unquote bad trip horse.
Now, Brian, you mentioned advantages earlier in handicapping and trying to put together winning wagers. They've kind of diminished over the course of time because there's so much information in the daily racing form statistically about what trainers do what well in different categories. Trip handicapping becomes one of our advantages, especially if you go back and watch a replay multiple times.
Because the thing about trip handicapping is a computer can't do it. That's the one thing. You know, you can have a computer essentially make your speed figures and you can make human adjustments to them. Any of that data more or less can be done automatically. Trip handicapping, that's all us, that's all you. It's something that you have to do and only your eyes can see it. One of the things that that's going to be very important too is starts and stops. James talked about the efficiency of a trip. I want to get my horse into a spot as soon as possible, the spot that they want to be in, and then settle and just sit and wait. I don't want the starts and stops. I don't want the, several moves.
Free running.
I'm as big a fan as a giant middle move as anybody, but that better be the only big move that gets made up to that point.
Horses only have one move. Sometimes it's a quarter of a mile move, sometimes it's a shorter move. You kind of get to know those horses. But when you're reading a chart, there's only so much the chart can tell you. There's only so much the short comment can tell you. I see a short comment that says off slowly, did the horse lose 1 length? Did the horse lose 5 lengths? Did the horse lose 12 lengths? You can only tell that by having seen the race.
Absolutely. And the nice thing about watching the race and visualizing is how hard did the horse actually have to work to do that kind of extra ground covering. I heard a great note about Bobby Frankel. He hated when he had to take his horses wide because he felt like it might take something out of him for the next race. So yes, we might talk about the poor trip and where they had to swing wide and watch him next time, but we also have to wonder, did that extra ground or did that jostling around, did that do something to the horse? So on the converse, you could fall into that trap, which you don't ever know until you actually see him run the second time out.
I think the turf is the greatest place to find trip horses because horses usually finish with energy. They oftentimes get stopped, and they oftentimes run better than it looks on paper. So I think how much energy a horse finishes with, and if they've had a tough trip to begin with, is a huge, huge thing. Horses can win without finishing with energy, and horses can run 7th finishing with a ton of energy.
Right.
So finishing with energy, to me, visually, is something that I'm always looking for.
And the other thing too, and this will come into play in turf races a lot, one of my favorite things to look for is a horse who gets shuffled back.
Yep.
In the running line, it may just look like the horse was still settled, 3rd, 2 lengths off the pace, all of a sudden they're 5th, 6 lengths off the pace. It's not always because the horse has just settled and the rider's not saying go. A lot of times speed is quitting back into a horse, and that's where sometimes that pocket trip doesn't become so advantageous. But horses who can, get shuffled back, lose that position, and still finish with energy, those are impressive horses. Those are the kind of things that I'm looking for, and I'm saying that's a horse I'm betting next time back.
Let's take a look at the replay from the 2013 edition of the Louisiana Derby, run over 9 furlongs on the main track at Fairgrounds. Now, in a 9 furlong race, or any race for that matter, there are several points that you want to be aware of when you're watching the replay. The gate break, the first turn, the backstretch, the stretch run, and of course, from a visual perspective, the finish and the gallop out are extremely important. Now, in a 14-horse field, surprisingly enough, there's not a lot of trouble as the horses leave the starting gate for the Louisiana Derby. Only 2 horses, in my opinion, may have been slightly compromised. Let's take a look at number 6, Sunbeam. This horse breaks away from the starting gate and is in just a little bit tight early. On the far outside, number 11, My Loot, also doesn't have the greatest break away from the starting gate. He's off a step slowly. Number 6, Sunbeam, and number 11, My Loot, may have lost a bit of position into the first turn because of their poor breaks from the starting gate. As they roll into the first turn, there's no truer saying in horse racing than pace makes the race. The faster they go early, the better chance there is for a horse to come from off the pace to perform well and or win. If the fractions are slow up front, the horses that are racing close to the top have a better chance to conserve energy and hang around at the end. Now, the pace of the Louisiana Derby was certainly honest. Fast, in fact, for a 9 furlong distance. As you can see here, Hip 469, the long shot, is battling through early fractions with the outside horse, Titletown 5. The splits are 22.84 and 46.34. Those are fractions that you would normally see in a 1-turn sprint race. Not to mention the fact that this is a 2-turn race going 9 furlongs. Those fractions are very, very honest. So when watching this race early on, the first thought that comes to my head is somebody's going to have to close to win. Before putting together this video spotlight of the Louisiana Derby, I watched the replay of this race several times, and I've zeroed in on 4 horses who may have been compromised by troubled trips. Let's take a look first at number 2, Palace Malice. Now, this horse is in decent position into the first turn, makes a huge middle move on the rail into what we've already talked about is a very fast pace. As the race continues into the stretch, Palace Malice is loaded. You can see the jockey just waiting for room. He has horse, but he has nowhere to put that horse. Palace Malice is blocked. He's bumped. He has nowhere to go. While the others on his outside are charging in full stride, Palace Malice has lost valuable momentum and therefore valuable ground. Palace Malice finishes evenly in the Louisiana Derby to find himself 7th across the line. But that troubled trip, the traffic combined with the lost momentum, and this race is practically a toss-out for this 3-year-old. He certainly deserves another chance. Now let's focus on number 6, Sunbeam. We've already established that he didn't have the greatest start away from the gate, but watch what happens to him on the turn as they approach the stretch run. Sunbeam is also loaded. He makes a huge move into traffic. He is absolutely blocked by a wall of horses. He checks very, very hard as they enter the stretch run. Now Sunbeam once again shakes free, finishes evenly at the end, but his momentum was completely stopped. Had he been on the outside with a clear run and a better trip, Sunbeam may have been a much bigger factor in the Louisiana Derby. He winds up finishing 8th. Now, the top 2 finishers in the Louisiana Derby were Revolutionary and My Loot, and neither horse had the greatest trip from the starting gate to the finish line. Let's start with race winner Revolutionary. He was 4 wide on the backstretch. He continues to advance into the turn and winds up losing a ton of ground. He is 5 wide as they turn for home and into the stretch run. Now, Revolutionary somehow is able to carry on that momentum despite the wide trip. He fights off the advances of My Loot to his outside and wins in a very gutsy performance. Now, not only did Revolutionary have a poor trip with the wide going almost the entire way around and the guts to dig in and fight off My Loot, but he gallops out like an absolute champ. Now, when horses are going from 1 1/8 to 1 1/4 miles, you like to see that strong gallop out. Revolutionary does not disappoint at any point in this race. He's 4 wide on the backstretch, 5 wide on the turn, fights off a challenge in the stretch, and still gallops out best of all. Now let's go back to race runner-up My Loot. We established earlier that he was off a step slow and may have lost valuable position into the first turn. Now My Loot makes a nice move on the backstretch, finds himself in some traffic trouble that he's able to negotiate while still in hand. He is forced to go 7 wide on the turn, and he runs right up to eventual race winner Revolutionary. That rival digs in. My Loot cannot get past, but My Loot does finish a clear second in this race, and he didn't have the greatest of trips. He was off a step slow. He was forced to go very wide in the turn after encountering some traffic, and he still finishes a very, very good second. Now note that My Loot had worn blinkers the entire race career. This race, the Louisiana Derby, he took those blinkers off. Some will say that My Loot hung in the stretch and he did not want to go past Revolutionary. Does My Loot need blinkers? That remains to be seen. Every replay we watch deserves thorough evaluation. Let's take a closer look at my notes for this year's Louisiana Derby. As we mentioned earlier, the pace in the race was fast, potentially aiding those coming from off the pace and compromising those who pressed into it. Let's take a look at the horses that I believe may have been compromised during the running of the Louisiana Derby. We'll start with number 2, Palace Malice. Here are my notes. The horse made a middle move on the rail into a fast pace, was loaded on the turn, was blocked at the rail, lost all momentum, was shuffled, and lost all chance, in my opinion. This horse deserves another chance moving forward. The winner, number 3, Revolutionary, was inside early but was forced 4 wide on the backstretch, was 5 wide entering the turn, obviously losing a ton of ground. The horse leveled off in the stretch, was challenged once he made the lead. He dug in and galloped out well in front. It was a huge performance, in my opinion, by Revolutionary. Number 6, Sunbeam, in tight early, as we mentioned, kind of a poor start for him. Moving rail, late backstretch and into the turn, and he was absolutely blocked. He was checked hard by the rider, losing all momentum. He too deserves another chance moving forward. Number 11, My Loot, who finished second in the race, off a step slowly. He rallied through traffic while still in hand, was forced 7 wide on the turn, losing a lot of ground. He too leveled off in the stretch, came to the leader Revolutionary, but could not get past. It was his first try without blinkers. Maybe he'll put them back on in the future. And finally, number 13, Ground Transport, who we have not discussed up to this point, but he was 4 wide on the first turn. He spied a very fast pace, was 5 wide on the second turn, loomed boldly, and then hung around pretty well considering that he was up close to those those early fast fractions. It was a good effort overall by ground transport, one that may not look as good on paper as it was in reality. Now let's take a look at two horses that I believe may have been aided by the race shape and the trip in the Louisiana Derby. Let's start with third place finisher Departing. Sure, he ran a big race, but he also got a lot better trip than some of his other rivals in the field. Departing saved ground on the first turn. He was only 3 or 4 wide on the far turn, and he was able to draft behind a wall of horses, which is not a bad thing if you're able to find racing room. He rallied off heels, finished well for the show dough, but as I mentioned earlier, he did get a good trip compared to some of his other rivals. The third place finish is going to look very good on paper. He's probably going to be one of the favorites in his next race, and I don't think the race was as good as it looked on paper. What about number 4, Golden Soul, who rallied from the back of the pack to be fourth? He was rated far back early, was clear on the outside when the real running began. He was 5 wide on the turn and 8 wide at the top of the stretch, but he did have clear sailing. He passed tired horses, and I believe that he was aided by the fast pace.
I believe all horse players evolve during the course of their handicapping careers. I know I certainly have. I started out knee-high to the inside rail at Charlestown in West Virginia, where speed was king. All you had to do was figure out who was the fastest horse in a 4.5 to 6.5 furlong race. It's like shooting fish in a barrel. If only it was that easy. Of course it wasn't that easy back then, and as I grew and my taste in handicapping grew as well, I learned that other aspects of the game weren't quite that easy as well. There's a lot more to handicapping than just lining up horses from point A to point B. And that's where trip handicapping comes into play. My trip handicapping really took off in the mid-1990s when I was employed by Equibase to be the official race chart caller at Remington Park and then later at Arapahoe Park in Colorado. I charted thousands of races in the mid-1990s and looking at those races over and over and over again in a quick time span, having to get the chart ready in 5 to 10 minutes before the next race post-parade began, really taught me how to fine-tune my skills and what to look for in a horse race. You don't have to be an Equibase chart caller to figure out good trip handicapping. I'm going to let you in on 5 secrets in this video that aren't about horses who were necessarily blocked and the quote-unquote trouble horses. There are a couple tips you can take for horses that are good plays and bad plays when they return next time.
One of the most dangerous scenarios in all of horse racing is a quality horse loose on the lead. Here from last year's racing at Keeneland, watch number 8, Day at the Spa in the Queen Elizabeth Challenge Cup. She easily makes the lead, going over and cuts over to the rail without being asked whatsoever by jockey Javier Castellano. The opening fractions for a quality horse, 24.52. That's 24 and 2/5 seconds. And watch how easily she's doing it, turning onto the backstretch. The ears are up, the head is up, and she is under an absolute snug hold from Javier Castellano. The others pursuing her at this point are in a lot of trouble. As we move ahead onto the far turn and the pace starts to pick it up, you'll see here Day at the Spa has maintained her advantage. And when she turns for home and passes the quarter pole here, the elbows go out with Javier Castellano and he begins the ride. He's pushing on the neck and she's reaching out and giving everything she's got because the opening fractions were so slow. 113 and 4, almost 114 flat for 6 furlongs. This filly is long gone. Look at the energy he has at the end. Day at the Spa, an easy winner, and this is the definition of loose on the lead. Now let's take a look what it means to do the dirty work. We go back to the Buffalo Trace Franklin County Stakes at the 2012 Keeneland Fall Meet. And Inspired, the 2-horse along the inside, is going to go flying out to the lead. When you open up a daylight lead against classy turf sprinters, you know the fractions are incredibly fast in most cases. The horse doing the dirty work today will be number 4. That is Bounding By. Her job is a difficult one here. She's chasing a runaway leader, and the natural speed of a horse is to go and attack those horses in front of them. But in this case, Inspired is running so fast it's ridiculous. 21 and 1 is flying over the Keeneland turf. You know this horse is going to come back, but unfortunately, Bounding By is the one who has to do all the work and the labor leading up to it. Meanwhile, sweeping up on the outside in the white shadow row in the green cap comes the race favorite. Her name is Madame Geary, and she's going to pick up all the pieces here. But notice in the purple, Bounding By, the filly who did all the hard work, still battling on, still game in a good performance, she's going to end up second best. Madame Geary gets the victory here, aided by the hard work and the dirty work of bounding by. When Madame Geary returned and didn't have that set up, she was beaten at 2-5 odds next time out in an allowance race at Gulfstream Park. Every athlete gets in a groove and thinks they've got things going their way, but sometimes it doesn't work out that way. It's called the confidence crusher. Our horse in the spotlight here is number 11, running second right now in the bright orange silks. His name is Dominus, and he's coming off a strong win in the Bernard Baruch at Saratoga. But here in the Shadwell Farm Turf Mile during the fall meet at Keeneland, he's going to learn what it's like to run into a tougher customer. The horse sweeping up on the outside is Wise Dan, the eventual horse of the year. Dominus cannot handle Wise Dan in this case. Turning for home, Dominus looks like he's going to give him everything he's got. But watch within a couple strides how Wise Dan just widens on him. He opens up a lead. And Dominus at this point looks like he could run second. But he throws out the anchor. He says, I am not competing anymore. He had his heart ripped out at this point and doesn't even finish on the board. Dominus crushed in confidence by Wise Dan. And since then, it has not been good for Dominus. The next time he showed up at 7-5 at Churchill Downs in the ACAC, he finished off the board once again. Wise Dan went on to be Horse of the Year. There is nothing, and I mean nothing, that impacts the pace and the trip more than field size. The simple number of horses determines a lot in how a horse race will shake out. On paper, as we go back to the First Lady Handicap at the 2012 Keeneland Fall Meet, there appeared to be a ton of speed on paper. Summer Soiree, the 5 on the lead. Daisy Divine, the 6 in second. And the gray Tappett's Fly, the 2-horse to the outside, all were expected to go towards the lead. But because we only had a 6-horse field, look how the field lines up. There's no urgency to find position in this field, so no one has to make an early move. It's single file, or at worst 2x2 heading into the far turn. Had this been a big field of 10, 12, 14 horses going into the first turn, horses would have had to separate more and hustle more to gain position. The short field size changed the face of this race early on, and it's going to completely change the way that it finishes and how it would have looked on paper. As we approach the top of the stretch, you see Daisy Divine now engaging Summer Soiree. Tappett's Fly, normally right up near the pace, is going to come right up and engage Daisy Divine. The gray, and then also the horse with the shadow roll, are going to separate themselves in the stretch now. Used to using more energy early, they didn't have to today. And in the stretch, they kick on not like front runners, but turn of foot kind of turf milers. And to the stretch they go, leaving Hungry Island, the closer, completely out of her element and unable to make up that kind of margin. The short field size changed the way this race looked on paper and certainly changed the way it played out on the track. Not every winner looks like $1 million, but if you cashed on them, congratulations. But on the bet back time, it may be time to say, yes, he won, but our example of that comes from the Keeneland Fall Meet last year, where Some of the Parts was wide open on the lead in the Phoenix Stakes. He got away quickly on the lead, and as we pick it up on the far turn, you can see Some of the Parts still in front comfortably. No one from the back of the pack is making any run whatsoever at this point. As they pass the quarter pole, he has not been asked by his rider yet. Lone Speed, the half and 46 flat, easy fractions, and now as the rider goes to work inside the 3/16th pole, you'll see him pushing hard and riding hard. And he's going to get that burst of acceleration and draw off by a little bit. But the stride soon shortens. He's got about 1/8 of a mile run in him, and he's starting to look for the finish line. You don't need but a few seconds to see in the gallop out that this horse was spent past the wire and a bet against in his return efforts. He's twice since shown speed and finished off the board after leading early.
Joe Christofek and Tom Kelly talking harness, trip, handicapping. And Tom, I've always been a big believer, and yes, I handle mostly thoroughbred racing, but I've worked in harness racing quite a bit too, that if you pay attention to harness races, you watch the races, you watch the replays, week in and week out, that can give you a serious advantage over paper handicappers, which is kind of the theme of this video. Tell people in general how important trip handicapping is in the standardbred game.
Well, I think it's very, very important, Joe. When you're watching a race and you have a wager on it, more than likely you're pretty much focused in on simply the horse you have or the horses you have. Say you have an exacta box or a tri box. So you're really not taking in the whole essence of exactly what's going on out there. All you want is a clear path to the wire for your horse, and you're hoping your horse has stays out of trouble, has a clear path, gets there first. Where you really make hay in the handicapping business is to really look at the replays of a race, and not necessarily just right after a race. I think you really have to sit down in some place that's a little bit quiet, not at the racetrack. Take a look at the tapes of races and really check out to see the inner workings of a race and how things went on, how they shaped up, because you can find yourself a lot of horses that encounter a lot of trouble that really it doesn't show up in the paper lines, as you put it. It can look like a horse just may have been, stale that night, and when in fact he had 2 or 3 different problems that night that he encountered. And when you look back at the replays, you may be able to pick that out.
Well, we're going to go through the different points of a race in the harness game, and then you've got some specific examples of some trouble horses and some horses that you've taken notes on from just a couple of weeks ago that we're going to take a look at as well. Let's start with the beginning of a harness race, Tom, and when the horses leave the starting gate, what kinds of things are you looking for as far as positioning, et cetera, and horses that may get into early trouble?
Well, I think you need to watch and see who gets hustled away from the gate. And your inside horses at times can kind of get jammed up down there. A lot of times if you talk to drivers, when they have their choice in big races, they don't always take the inside post because that kind of forces their hand. They're forced to get out of there or they're going to get jammed up. And it's the same way in a $4,000 claiming event. Same thing, they have to be hustled away from the gate. And a lot of times horses just aren't capable of that. So you have to watch. Sometimes a horse gets hustled away and gets a little bobbly in the first turn, may, force a driver to kind of take a hold of them a bit. So keep an eye out for that. Also keep an eye out for horses that are pushed a bit wide in that first turn. And that can happen from your outside post. When you do get a bunch of inside levers, all of a sudden a driver from the outside may not have been expecting 4 or 5 horses to leave from the inside. He gets carried 4 or 5 deep into that first turn. And a lot of that has to do with the size of the track you're handicapping. So on the mile track with the 7/8, say at Hoosier, they've got a long run into the first turn. I shouldn't say run, but a long distance into the first turn. But horses are much more able to get settled in and find themselves in single file, kind of going around that first turn. Where at Balmoral, even though it's a mile track, it's very short distance from the time they're released from the gate into that first turn, and you can get a lot of horses that get stuck outside there.
Well, let's talk about through the first turn and when the horses sort themselves out on the backstretch, and also talk about the outer flow and how harness races develop. Once the early position is established, then there's a secondary form of position as the horses try to put themselves into an area where they can make their best race and potentially make their best stretch position in order to give themselves their best chance to win.
Well, I think this is kind of where a race sorts itself out, and it almost can tell you right there whether you've got a chance in that race or not. Because you'll look, a lot of drivers will try and position themselves behind horses that are the so-called live horses in the race. So you'll see horses drop in, just try and sit through the first turn, even if it's outside, trying to flush some cover as they head onto the backstretch, so they have somebody to lead their way out. So it doesn't necessarily first going into the first turn, you don't necessarily want to see your horse get right over to the pylons, especially if he's getting in behind some dead horses, and also getting away in that 3-hole. And it doesn't seem to matter what the size of the track. That just seems to be a death sentence because you have to make the first move if you get away in that 3-hole. Doesn't matter the size of the track. You're either going to be the first to pull or you're staying inside, and more than likely you're getting shuffled back. So I think that first turn is very crucial where drivers position their horses, and that's when you can kind of figure out what your chances are in a race and basically how that race is going to develop.
Now, we talk about saving ground in harness races and thoroughbred races, but you talk about an outer flow and you talk about being in the 2-path and even wider sometimes and getting that live cover and so on and so forth. How much does ground loss come into play? How much do you take into consideration ground loss in your trip notes? And is a lot of it based on the cover that the horses have and how live it might be?
Again, the size of the track comes into play there. Half-mile track, 4 turns to a mile. So if you're outside, you're covering a lot more ground. 5/8's not quite as bad. Mile track, you can survive being outside, especially if you have cover. So I think the main thing is to be able to have yourself a clear path, even if it's to the outside of horses, but mainly getting a horse to be your blocker, having cover from that horse. I think that's the big key in a race. As long as you have an outer flow that's going to continue to move, not stall and back right up into your face, I think you're in good shape there. Even if you have to go, a few more yards than the horses inside of you, I think you can still get the job done as long as you have a live cover.
Yeah, momentum is certainly the name of the game. Tom, how much does pace come into play in a harness race? It would seem to me that the faster the pace in most races, the better chances the horses with late closing moves have to race well or win, depending on, of course, their trip and their cover. But you're obviously looking at the pace of each individual race based on the class of the racehorse. But when you look at that pace, how much consideration do you give it when you look at the final result?
Well, I think you definitely have to take a good look at it, especially if you're a guy like I am who really kind of tend to pay attention to final quarters in the race. You can't get sucked into all of a sudden a horse has a 27 final quarter because they got down to the 3/4 in a very slow time. You've got to check out all the fractions in a race to see if they're honest. And also, it's not such a bad thing if a horse comes home in 29 and change if they got down to the 3/4 in an exceptionally fast time. And you'll have certain drivers that have tried a strategy. I'm sure the thoroughbreds do it quite often too, where they just basically try to bottom a field out by going so fast that they take away any of the closer's ability as well because they're trying to stay close to the pace. They're not going to have their usual late kick turning for home. So they figure if they can open up 4 or 5 lanes and go fast enough, they'll take the sting out of the closers, try and bottom them out. A lot of times that'll happen on the smaller tracks, and certain drivers like a George Brennan, very, very good at doing that.
Now, in any game of horse racing, the object is to save as much horse for what we like to call the stretch run. How does it come into play as far as your trip handicapping goes when you're looking at the final quarter of a mile of a race and seeing not only where the horses are positioned and how much ground they have to make up and how fast that final quarter is, but also the traffic involved, the final time, and so on and so forth, and the way those horses are finishing visually?
Well, that's the way you really have to go back and watch the replays of a race. Watch that final quarter mile a couple times because horses, it's not real easy. I would say it's probably easier to move a thoroughbred around some traffic than it is a harness horse. Remember, you've got a sulky behind you as well. Not only the horse do you have to move, but you have to move the sulky, get your wheels clear of everything. So, and these things are not like driving cars. A lot of people tend to think they are because some of these drivers make it look so easy. But you've got to look to see if a horse has clearance, who's locked behind horses that may be starting to back up, whether there's a clearance on the inside, and whether a horse makes a smooth move. A lot of times you'll see a horse move to the outside, but it's kind of a herky-jerky kind of motion. And when that happens, I mean, that causes a horse to lose momentum. So the guys with the great hands, they can just kind of steadily slide outside and get themselves clearance to go on. Where a lot of the more inexperienced drivers or anything, it'll almost kind of be like a snatch and grab, and the next thing you know, they've lost momentum with their horse. So I think you go back over that replay, look at it several times to see who may have a clear path to the wire and who maybe appears to have a clear path to the wire but really doesn't because he can't get around maybe a set of wheels.
Well, Tom, you have 4 specific examples you want to show us on the video end of things. Let's go through each one of those. Explain to the racing fans what they're looking at, what you're looking for, and why it's important.
All right, well, the first example I want to take a look at here is a race from the Meadowlands last Saturday night. And all the races that we're going to be looking at in these examples are from the Meadowlands. This is race 5 from last Saturday night at the Meadowlands. The horse we're going to focus in on here is the favorite in the race, number 3, Kiss My Art, with Andy Miller driving. If you take a look at this horse when they leave, this horse gets hustled away from the gate by Andy, and everything appears to be good for the first maybe 30 yards or so. Then things kind of start to tighten up in that first turn. He winds up making a break in the first turn, and that causes Andy to drop back with him on the outside, and it's a pretty nasty break that he makes. So you'll see Andy have to grab him up pretty good, and as he proceeds toward the back of the field, as he's doing that, you could take a look at a second horse in the race that kind of this hampers as well. That's the 10 Prince Sharka. When Andy's horse makes the break, Prince Sharka's forced to swing way wide around him. Prince Sharka then manages to get over to the pylons as they head up the backstretch after he avoids that mishap. And once he gets over there, it seems like the driver on Prince Sharka just content, after he's been around one piece of trouble already, just content to stay on the inside. He winds up getting locked in, Prince Sharka does, and never finding any room. And you watch him when he comes down the stretch. He finishes up with some pace, but absolutely has nowhere to go. And then going back to the 3, Kiss My Art, who I think you could probably play back in the situation, give the beaten favorite a chance. He loses probably a good 8 to 10 lengths off the break after the start. When Andy finally basically allows him to settle, he's at the back of the pack and on the outside of horses. He ends up following an outer flow then that really isn't a real live outer flow. What I would call just kind of a medium outer flow. Leads him up to the midpoint pack, and then he ends up flattening out a little bit, which he has every right to do again in the stretch. Finishes 6th, ends up being DQ'd to the back of the pack for causing the interference in the first turn. But that's something you've got to see, and I think you have to watch. You want to make note that this horse recovered from the break, made up a good 8 to 10 lengths on the field after spotting him that. So through the middle half of the race, he paces a pretty big middle half of the race. Take away the break, and he paces that kind of half of the flat mile, and I think you might have a winner on your hands.
Okay, Tom, let's move on to examples 2, 3, and 4.
All right, the next example I'd like to take a look at also took place last Saturday night at the Meadowlands. Race number 10, and it's the 7-horse Hacienda with Vinnie Ginsburg driving that I want to take a look at. Now, watch the 7-horse Hacienda as he gets away to a slow start. That ends up costing him a valuable striking position as Vinnie decides to sit in with the horse until they get to the backstretch. I think that cost them very, very good striking position because there was a live outer flow heading up the backside. He winds up, when he does get outside, going into basically a horrible second tier. By that time, horses have settled themselves in, and now he's out and going with all the horses that really didn't figure in the race to be outside of him. So if you watch, the outer flow stalls in front of him. He gets out there. This forces Hacienda to finally move 3, 4, 5 wide around that last turn as they all completely stall. He unleashes a 27-second final quarter to salvage a third-place check in the race. I thought it was one heck of an effort, and you can bet I'll be on Hacienda again next time out.
Sounds like Tom wasn't a big fan of that drive. Example number 3, Tom?
All right, if we're going to take a look at race 1 from the Friday night card at the Meadowlands last week. We'll see another example of a horse getting stuck behind poor cover in this event. And when he does get out, he's second over, and the horse first over just completely stalls in his face. Usually you get out second over in a race and you think you're in prime striking position. You're absolutely licking your chops, loving where this horse is. Unfortunately, this horse gets behind a horse, stalls, pushes him to the back of the pack almost before he goes 3 wide. That's tough enough to do in a pacing event to come back. This is a trotter that it happens to here. And when the trotters, this happens to a trotter, it always seems to be tougher to overcome. The trotters just don't have that quick burst of speed like the pacers. They kind of need to be steadied a little more. But this horse trots home in 27-2 to finish third. He ends up making up 10 lengths in the stretch, but it's only good enough for a third-place check. If he gets live cover to bring him close and then trots anywhere near that 27-2 final quarter, he blows by the field for an open length score. So I would definitely keep an eye on that horse next time out.
And again, momentum means everything in horse racing. Having it stopped and having to start again, definitely not a positive thing. And your final example.
All right, the final example that we're going to look at is from 2 weeks back, and it's a horse that gets locked in. The driver just chooses to stay in with the horse, and it's from the April 6th card at the Big M. I'm going to look at Muscles from Brussels in race 3. Now, his driver is Simon Allard, and I don't know if this is a horse that can't take error, doesn't like to take error, and by that meaning he doesn't like to come first up. He's okay if he's on the outside, but he has cover. Simon elects to stay in. And when he does so, he gets pushed back all the way to the top of the stretch, has absolutely no racing room. He really never secures the room that he needs until probably a quarter of the way down the stretch. Once he gets out, you'll see him come flying home between horses. He splits horses, just misses at the wire. Now, like I said, maybe it's a fact that the horse doesn't like to take air or driver error. I hate to put that one out there, but whatever the case, Muscles from Brussels was absolutely flying late in that start. He's about due to pull off a nice win at the Meadowlands.
All right, Tom. And to wrap things up on the harness side of trip handicapping, how do conditions of the racetrack, weather, and track bias play into everything you've already talked about?
Well, I think you definitely have to note the conditions, and a lot of tracks list track variant. Make that part of your handicapping. Learn what that's all about. We have a bias at Balmoral. When the wind blows strong into the horse's face in the home stretch, you have to be up close. All of a sudden, you'll see horses that don't normally show speed head for the front or make early quarter moves because they know they have to be sitting on the lead or maybe first up or second up, but they can't be any worse than sitting third or fourth if they're going to get the job done in that kind of bias. And other times, same thing, sloppy tracks, the water tends to run down toward the inside. Those tracks get heavier on the inside. Horses tend to tire if they're out there. You'll see horses drift. Drivers let them drift out a little more to get them away from that heavy footing. And so know what the biases are at the track you're playing. Know what the conditions are. Check the charts and check the replays to see if certain things are happening continually that night. If you figure out what a bias is, you might come up with some nice horses that people don't necessarily spot.
Well, that's exactly the moral of this story, Tom Kelly, is that trip handicapping, it's all about visuals. You have an advantage over the people that are only handicapping on paper with those little 3-word short comments that tell you a little bit about what happened in the race, but don't give you the full story. For Tom Kelly, I'm Joe Christofek. That's a look at harness trip handicapping.
Next on FAQ 60, race charts. Each American quarter horse race has an official chart that tells handicappers what happened nearly every step of the way. The chart will help you identify which horses break fastest from the gate, which ones finish strongest, and which horses encountered unlucky traffic. A chart of every race is entered into a national database, so the next time those horses appear, handicappers can study their past performances. American quarter horse charts are built with the human eye as well as the photo finish camera, which combine to provide short expert commentary and individual times that are calculated for all important speed figures. While you're watching what your horse is doing, the official chart caller is taking in the entire field, both live and later through video replays. A lot happens on the track, and a good official race chart catches it all. Race replays. There's an old saying in handicapping that we're never wrong in the replay, but even horse players who sometimes swing and miss can learn a lot by rewatching races. Thanks to online video, race replays are one of the most important tools in handicapping. Now you can go back in time to see exactly what happened in a recent race. AQHA's Q Racing video is one example, and it's free of charge. Replays show you just how much trouble a horse may have gotten into when you spot a trouble line in the past performances. Replay study can tell you just how hard a runner was asked late in a race, whether he won with something left in the tank or left it all out on the track. Your eyes are exclusively yours, and by carefully studying replays, smart horse players find an edge. Trip handicapping. The shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, and American quarter horse handicappers know it's the fastest way to get there. When races are decided by hundredths or thousandths of a second, trip handicapping is magnified so much more than when playing thoroughbreds. Here are the keys to trip handicapping. 1. The start. You want your horse's head straight, looking down the track. 2. You need a clean exit from the gate. 3. Maintain a straight path. Don't waste energy and time drifting in or out. And 4, your horse needs to outrun rivals to avoid trouble. Speed is what you need to avoid others. Head-on replays are critical tools in your pursuit of finding trip handicapping gems. Problem horses. Sometimes a horse can be his own worst enemy. Other times, he's a victim of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Determining which horses simply have bad luck and which ones are bad actors is the key to identifying problem horses. A horse who has trouble comments in more than half of his races is a red flag. Look for a common thread in the comments. Repeat comments can be a sign that the horse is a bad actor. Comments that mix offenses, bumped both sides start, or shied from rival can indicate simply bad racing luck. Also, notice if similar trouble comments appear when braking from certain post positions, which can be a sign of a horse who has some self-made issues. Hooking up. One popular handicapping angle in American quarter horse racing has a catchy name and a place in the toolbox of many horse players: hooking up. That's when two horses racing alongside one another hook up and bring out the best in each other. Many horses run only as fast as those around them, so breaking next to the fastest horse in the race can be a perfect date. Hooking up also makes sense as a handicapping angle when you consider traffic trouble. Often the race winner is the fastest horse who has the cleanest trip. By running alongside a horse with a clean trip, the runner-up can have smooth sailing. Remember, what's lucky for good old number 7 can also be good for numbers 6 and 8. This FAQ 60 is presented by AQHA Racing and Horse Player Now. For more, go to AQHARacing.com.
Looking for a fun and easy way to learn more about horse racing? Night School, Tuesday nights. Enjoy access to top racing insiders via chat, video, and radio. Night School caters to fans at all levels. Miss a class? Read the archive. Night School, Tuesday nights. See you then.